Welcome to this meeting of the Liberal Democrat History Group. This meeting will go onto our website, so it is on the record. So there are just a few hesitations about how much you wish to talk about particular items of the election campaign. Can I just ask, is there anyone here who is not currently a member of the Liberal Democrat Party? Well, just useful to know. Thank you. Well, as I say, this will be on the website. It's very good to have Paul Surridge, who is an expert on elections and will give us informed views. I have just been looking back at the work I did on election statistics in the 1960s, when as a graduate student, I was at the cutting edge of technology, which meant that I was using punch cards and generating great streams of paper as analysis. Life's much easier now. And then we have Dave McCobb, who I can remember canvassing with when he was an undergraduate. And I can remember a few years later going back to Hull and saying to the then leader of the council, what happened to all those undergraduates who, without intending to gain control of the council, and the leader of the council smiled very sweetly and said, we're still here. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Paula to speak first, and then Dave to give us some of the background. Good. Paula, I don't need.
Thank you.
From that.
I want to speak from up here. Not sure quite how that works. And I think I'm in a slide please world. Is that correct? Which makes me feel like I should be doing a code briefing. You have to excuse me. I'm at the awkward point where I can't see this without my glasses, and I can't see you with them. So I'm constantly taking them up and down off my head. Now, I've been spending a lot of time since July trying to put together the story of the election. Thank you. And it's not a simple task. At one level, it seems like a very easy task. The Conservatives lost lots of votes, and we could just leave the story there. But that isn't really telling us what actually happened in any detail. And the trouble is, as soon as you try to unpick that any further, you fall into two stories. You fall into this story, which is about vote share. And if I could have the next slide, please. Sorry. And then you fall into another completely different story, which is about the number of seats each party won. Now, I certainly don't need to talk to this group about the relationship between votes and seats. I mean, that really would be on the pale, I think. But this is a story that's much more difficult to tell, I think, for the Liberal Democrats than for any other party. Although lots of people have talked about, the relationship between seats and votes for the Labour Party, you've got two completely different stories to tell when you're talking about the Liberal Democrats. You're talking about virtually unchanged vote share and a huge increase in the number of seats. So depending on what level you tell the story, you end up telling quite different stories. And I think this is going to be a persistent challenge. Maybe in 100 years' time, somebody else will stand in this room and look back at their experiences and think this was an election that it was very difficult to tell the story of. If I could have the next slide, please. So at the start of the election campaign, I think the Liberal Democrats could not have been better placed for the Conservative Party to collapse. Remember, you're already in second place in all these seats. A collapse of the Conservative Party was the perfect outcome, really, for the Liberal Democrats. But what I wanted to show just as context, was that going into the next election, the battleground looks really very different. And what we've got going into the next election is a complexity to the types of seat contests that we didn't have going into 2019 or 2017. And that's something about the new political reality and how durable that will be that I want to try and explore. But first of all, I'm going to go back to that. This is where I'm in this constant kind of bind between the individual level story and the seat level story. And I'm going to try to untangle that a little bit. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I wanted to start off looking at where the 2024 Liberal Democrat vote came from in terms of their 2019 voting behaviour. So if we start off with the premise that at the very least, you want to hold on to all the people who voted for you in 2024, which seems like a good starting point for most political parties. Knowing where they came from seems to me to be a good first point in that. And I think this also captures some of the challenges for the party to come, because although about 45% had previously voted for the Liberal Democrats, about the same amount came from Labour and from the Conservatives, so that the new votes that came in came about equally from both. Not absolutely equally, actually very slightly more from Labour, but it wasn't dominated by one or the other. So it doesn't leave you an easy strategy as how do you hold on to these, because you've got voters potentially going back to either party, and how do you square that circle and hold on to them all? Well, one way to start thinking about that, if I could have the next slide, please, is to look at whether those groups of voters are different in any ways from the Liberal Democrat voters that were already voting for the party and from each other. So have you got a coherent social mix with voters that were very similar coming in, or have you now got this kind of slightly strange coalition that all parties are, but that are much harder to hold together? What you can see that stands out most from this looking at age and gender is that the voters that came into the party from Labour, the red bars, were much younger on average, whereas those that came from the Conservatives were a little bit older, but not as much difference. We tend to see that throughout these demographics, that those that came to the party from the Conservatives look a little bit more like the people that were already there than those that came from Labour. If I could have the next slide, please. This is the same breakdown in terms of the groups, but just looking at a slightly broader range of socioeconomic characteristics. I think here, that point about the ones coming from the Conservatives looking a little bit more like the Lib Dems that were already there comes through, particularly in terms of home ownership, which is one of the key markers we have on the data of kind of wealth. The Labour voters are much less likely to be owning the houses outright than those that came from the Conservatives and those that came from the Lib Dems. Probably reflecting to some extent the age breakdown that we saw in the previous chart. And if I could have the next slide, please. This then looks at what their most important issues were. And I think this is perhaps one of the places where there's some cause for optimism for the party, in that the voters that came to the Liberal Democrats shared similar priorities regardless of where they came from. You get a bit of a bump around immigration for those that came from the Conservatives, but broadly, health and the economy were the most important issues for all the groups, whether they'd voted Labour, Liberal Democrat or Conservative in the past. Thank you. Now, my work has focused particularly on the political values of voters. So I wanted to just show you a few things about political values. Apologies for the very wordy slide, but if I just talk about these value scales without showing you what goes into them, then people think they're made up of other things than the actual item. So these are scales that were first collected in 1985, I believe, certainly in the mid-80s, and they've been collected on every election study since. So they're a really long time series. And I think it's testament to the people who designed these items that they still explain our politics now. You know, the items that they came up with 40 years ago are still doing a really good job of explaining our politics. It's important, though, just to point out what is not part of these scales. These scales do not have any of the kind of current top issues. They don't have things like abortion, things like attitudes to gay marriage, things like attitudes to statues, all those kind of more things that might have been in the kind of culture war space are not part of these measures. There isn't anything here about immigration. They're not designed to be about specific policies. They're designed to be more about what kind of world you'd like to live in. If I could have the next slide, please. I apologise for doing this really rather rapidly, But what I do with those two scales is to chop each one into 3 parts so that I can make a grid of distinctive positions, because people's positions on the 2 scales don't match up perfectly. In fact, you can't really predict one's position on one scale from the other. If I know what you think about redistribution, I'm going to have a poor time working out what you think about the death penalty. Probably not in this room, but in the population as a whole. Those two things aren't necessarily correlated. So you get these distinctive spaces within the political sphere. This chart is just to show you the relative sizes of the groups and how that's changed over the last 10 years. There's more people on the left than on the right. There are more people in the moderate and authoritarian groups than in the most liberal group. But on the left in particular, since 2014, there's been a bit of a rebalancing between the authoritarian group and the liberal group. So the left liberal group has grown relative to the left authoritarian group over this 10-year period. Something we would expect as a population is becoming more educated. Could I have the next slide, please? This then shows the distribution of those 3 groups across this space. And you can see here there's some quite distinctive patterns in that those that came to the party from Labour were very likely to have been drawn from that most left-wing, most liberal grouping. That's where most of the voters that came from Labour came from. Whereas those that came from the Conservatives are a bit more likely to be in the centre and in the, we'll call them the not liberal groups. Not that they're not liberal, but they're not the most liberal groups. You get a slightly different picture of their political values. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, this is where we need to make these 2 stories, match up. We've looked at the individual level, and now we've got to try and somehow explain what happened at the aggregate level. And obviously, the first thing that comes to mind when we try to do that is tactical voting. So this shows the percentage, and the top chart tells you various reasons people gave for voting for different parties. The proportion saying that they preferred another party is not as large as you might expect, but then we're asking voters after they voted, and voters are very good at giving post hoc rationalizations for why they voted, rather than saying that they voted tactically. But we can see there are more tactical voters amongst the Liberal Democrat vote than amongst any of the other parties. Very, very few tactical voters for the Greens. There were very few constituencies where a vote for the Greens would have been a good tactical call. Very, very few tactical voters for Reform, very few for the Conservatives. Of those that said they voted tactically for each party, the survey then asked them who they really preferred. So you can see here this switch around between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and to some extent the Greens. So those that voted Liberal Democrat, but who said they'd voted tactically and really preferred someone else, over half of them preferred Labour. They were voting tactically for the Lib Dems, but they really preferred Labour, with around a third, just under a third, saying they actually really preferred the Greens. So you can see again why you're getting those voters coming in from that liberal left segment. And having shown you that at the individual level, demographically, there's not that much between them, that some of these voters are quite similar in terms of their priorities. If I could have the next slide, please. We can see that the tactical voters are quite different. So I've broken the voters down now according to the type of seat they were in. So trying to take into account that tactical situation. So the blue bars are people who voted Lib Dem in a seat that the Lib Dems didn't win. Very committed Lib Dems, I would say, if you were voting Lib Dem in seats where the Lib Dems didn't have any chance of winning. Voted Lib Dem in a seat that the Lib Dems won and the Lib Dems were their first choice. So didn't vote tactically as such. And then the pink bars, and I don't know why they're pink, I'm sorry about that, they just came out that way. The Lib Dems in a seat that the Lib Dems won, but another party was their first choice. And if you look at those 3 charts, you can see that for that group, for the group who voted tactically for the Lib Dems in the seats that you won, almost half are coming from that left liberal group. So they're a very distinctive, actually, group of voters. And given that they will be really important to hold on to hold those seats, understanding that they're quite distinctive, I think, is a good starting point for doing that. If we could have the next slide, please. This again is those same three groups, and again that pink group stand out. And this is how much they liked the Conservatives on a 0 to 10 scale. Now, given that we're talking about just after the 2024 election, we wouldn't expect, you know, a great deal of love for the Conservatives amongst any of these groups. But those that came to the Liberal Democrats with another party as their first choice, particularly disliked the Conservatives. Almost 6 in 10 of them gave them 0 out of 10 in terms of likability. The Lib Dems that were voting Lib Dem in seats where you didn't win, it's only 35% that were giving the Conservatives, not even in 2024, they were giving them 0 out of 10. So this group that came to the Liberal Democrats predominantly with a preference for Labour or having voted Labour in 2019, they're likely to be tactical voters, very, very strong dislike of the Conservatives and a very distinctive set of values. They're a group of voters that I don't think that 60% is going to drop down much between now and the next election. They don't like the Conservatives, and I don't think they're going to kind of magically find any love for the Conservatives. However, they are a group with some very strong opinions on key issues, and it is possible to alienate them on key issues if, you know, a small misstep could be very costly on, on some issues for that particular group of voters, is I think how I prefer to put it. I've just got 2 more slides. If I could have the next one, please. So, I mean, I've got some history. I go back to 1918, so we've got some history in there. That's a good start. This is the share of the votes at general elections. The colours match the parties broadly. And what I would like everyone in the room to do is have a think about where you think that grey line, which is the votes for parties outside of Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem, where will that grey line be in 2028? Have we gone back onto what looked like a trend line from 2010, 2015 and 2024, or is 2024 the outlier? And that's the question we don't know the answer to, but it's the critical question for what's going to happen at the next election, I think. Were 2017 and 2019, which I kind of like to think of as the elections we should never have had, are they the outliers? And are we going to carry on that trajectory? I certainly wouldn't bet against it. And if that's the case, we're going to be in a world of highly fragmented politics. 34% as a winning vote share might actually start to look quite high. And all bets are off in terms of what the electoral system does with that. If you end up with 3 or 4 parties all polling between 20 and 28%, all bets are off in terms of what happens next. However, I do have another little glimmer of hope for the Liberal Democrats in the room. I like to finish on a high. This is asking people which party they would vote against, broken down by which party they voted for. So you can see that the Conservatives largely would vote against Labour, Labour would largely vote against the Conservatives or Reform. But if you look across there, nobody would vote against the Liberal Democrats. And I think, actually, in a highly fragmented system, that might not be a bad place to be, actually. In a world where everybody hates politics, everybody's a little bit apathetic, being the party that nobody dislikes might actually be might be a good place to be. So if I could have my final slide, please. So I think these are the 2 questions in terms of moving forward, which I have no intention of trying to answer, but really just intend to pose. And that is, to move on from here, should the strategy be holding seats or gaining votes? And those 2 things do not necessarily go hand in hand. Any of the parties could gain votes and still lose seats. So I think it's something that requires some very serious consideration for all parties. And do you bet on that grey line continuing to go up, or do you bet on having another 2017? Is multi-party competition here to stay or not? I'm not a gambling lady. If I was, I would probably bet on it being here to stay. But I lose a lot of bets, so I wouldn't necessarily follow my advice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you. I'm Dave McCobb. I'm the party's Director of Field Campaigns, and I led the campaigning operation from 2020 through to now. Before I start, I'd probably just want to say a massive thank you to everybody in the audience, whether in person or online, who contributed to the general election result. I'll talk through some of the stuff we did centrally, but obviously none of that would have been possible without the people who donated, pounded the pavements, knocked on doors, delivered leaflets, all the stuff that makes elections work. So whilst I'll talk about some of the stuff we did centrally, I just want to say thank you to everybody who contributed in any way. So if we move on, yes, so just to prove I'm not actually making it up, I genuinely was the Lib Dem Director of Campaigns in the last Parliament, and here's some interviews with me in one of the books that got written about the general election. I can't actually remember which, but yeah. So that's me. If we move on, so I kind of wanted to start with the background to what we did this time that I think was different. And the first, so in summary, I think we learned some of the lessons from what didn't work so well in 2019. We united the party around a single clear strategy. We built a strong organisation capable of delivering election wins at every level, and I want to emphasise at every level, and I think that's really important. That's something I'll come back to later on. We spoke to our target voters about issues they cared about. That might not sound revolutionary, but in some quarters occasionally it is. And we use data to inform and constantly review our overall approach. Thinking back to where this started in 2019, there'd been high hopes. The party had gone up in the polls. Our national poll rating had gone up quite a lot. There'd been a series of defections. It felt like the party was on an upward trajectory, but it wasn't to be. And we ended up in a situation where we ended up with more votes and one fewer seat than we'd had at the previous election. And kind of my analysis of that was the party essentially fought what I call a PR strategy for a first past the post election, which is that some of the stuff that the party did kind of between 2017 and 19 drove up the party's national vote share by appealing to people who already thought like us, but those people were too evenly spread around the country to translate those votes into seats. So for me, some of the core lessons were clear. We'd invested in our ground operation consistently since 2010. We had alienated too many voters for a first past the post election, or on Paula's point about who are people likely to vote against. There were too many people who didn't agree with the core proposition of the Lib Dems in 2019 to make it as a viable proposition in enough constituencies to get a big enough coalition of voters. And the party was sort of inconsistent and overconfident in the number of seats we were trying to win in 2019. So a lot of the thinking was about how do we address these core problems that were fairly evident from 2019. So it starts on the next slide. I took over as Director of Campaigns in 2020 with kind of quite a strong, so we had the Dorothy Thornhill review. For those of you who are party members, you probably remember that was sort of a fairly root and branch review of what had gone right and wrong and where the party needed to focus for this Parliament. Kind of that was a core input, and also a lot of the thinking that I sort of talked about myself on the previous slide. I agreed to stay, having worked in various Lib Dem jobs for quite a while. I agreed to stay on when our chief exec asked me to, essentially on the condition that we were able to do it properly, in my view, and that involved investing in our field operation and fighting a first past the post strategy, not a PR strategy. Key to that is that winning under first past the post is about seats, not votes. And that's quite an important distinction. In 2019, the party's vote share increased by about 50% compared to the previous general election, but we got no more seats. In a PR system, if you find people who look like your core voters and persuade people that kind of you agree with them on a whole sort of kind of load of values basis, and you increase your core vote, say, increase your national vote share, that translates to seats. That doesn't do that under first past the post. What you actually need to do is build a coalition of voters that can get you to 45-50% of the vote in constituencies. And we need kind of a lid, we need to make sure there's no ceiling on that. And kind of barriers to people voting for us who might not naturally think of themselves as Liberal or Lib Dems. Obviously, as one of the smaller parties, one of the most critical barriers we always have to overcome, and it's the same for kind of anyone apart from Labour and the Tories in UK politics, is you've got to overcome the perception that people can't win, and also kind of between sort of 2015 and 2019. Lots of stuff had happened in the party which made it actually quite difficult for the whole party to unite around a clear strategy. So part of actually what I set out to do, and particularly spent a lot of the first year of kind of in post doing, was just securing party-wide buy-in to this overall approach about how we were going to tackle the next general election. Thank you. So the first element of that was I got sort of early investment in growing our field staff team. We invested strongly in people. I kind of very firmly believe that if we, if the route to victory is building up a kind of 45–50% of the vote in constituencies, we need big organized groups of people doing that. In order to develop big organized groups of people, you need people to organize them, to train them, to develop them, to set them on the right track. So we invested in growing our field network. Once we'd done that from an HQ end, I then set about consolidating what had become a fragmented staffing structure across the party. I see some people in the room who helped us do that. Between sort of 2010 and 2019, lots of different organisational units of the party were hiring staff to do worthwhile and useful things, but in the absence of any kind of coherent framework or underpinning sense of collective strategy about what we were trying to do. So we knitted all of that stuff together and made it very much more we kind of made it more than the sum of the parts, and used that increased staff network and a huge amount of relationship building at the start of the Parliament to build that really clear sense of mission and strategy and overall approach. On the next slide, we kind of set some clear targets around some core things. There are vast amounts of things that make a difference to elections. I generally took it as I viewed that it was my role to make it as easy as possible for people to do as many of the right things as much of the time as possible. So I developed a bit of a mantra that kind of I just wanted people to focus in the short term, at least, on getting 4 things right: getting the volume of literature that we put out, getting our views across to voters up, having more conversations with voters, fundraising to enable us to do the first 2 things, and growing the size of the team to enable us to do the first 2 things. And whilst that might sound remarkably simplistic, actually just getting that discipline through the whole organisation to say that's what we're going to focus on, that's what we're going to do, took a lot of time. We regularly monitored progress against those key targets over the course of the Parliament, and we put proper resource into trying to make those things happen. We invested in local elections. If one of the reasons people don't vote Lib Dem is they don't think that we're going to win and they think the choice is between somebody else, nothing punctures that perception more than us winning at every level, at every election that comes round. So over the course of the Parliament, we significantly increased the number of Lib Dem councillors, especially in our Westminster target seats. We were obviously trying to increase the number of Lib Dem councillors everywhere because it's a good thing in its own right. But we paid particular attention to Lib Dem councillors in places where we were either definitely challenging or potentially challenging at the general election. And there were many places where we went from being a relatively small main opposition at the start of the Parliament to being completely dominant in local government by the end. So somewhere like Woking, for example, where we got a massive majority in the end in Woking, we completely wiped the Conservatives out at district council level over the course of the Parliament. We've gone from them running the council with a big majority in 2015 to there not being a Conservative councillor left in Woking by the time the general election was called at district level. And if one of the drags on the Lib Dem ticket is people think we might not win, us winning every round of elections resoundingly, running the local council is the counter proof point. Not only, of course, is it good in its own right because we're able to do positive things for people in their communities, and that's where a lot of the party's reputation comes from. Not only is it good because it tackles that sort of winning credibility issue that we sometimes face, but also it builds up a big team of people who also have skin in the game and a vested interest in growing a team of people who want to go out and campaign for the Lib Dems. So we also took advantage of opportunities that came up across the course of the Parliament. Hopefully people will recognise the 4 photos that came from the parliamentary by-elections that we won. These were fantastic opportunities to motivate our team. When I took over in 2020, it's fair to say that the kind of people were fairly down after a disappointing general election and then being locked down during COVID. Winning in Cheshire and Amersham and then going on to win in all the other by-elections kind of got people it got our activists' confidence up, it got their enthusiasm up, it got their belief that the advice we were giving on what teams needed to do was right, that we had a team that was capable of kind of running a winning election. It provided credibility with the media. I think when we won Cheshire and Amersham, no one really saw it coming. The media didn't send anybody really to interview our candidate or to follow the by-election until maybe the last 2 or 3 days. I remember it's sort of hard to put in place, just sort of think about it now. But at the point where we started the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, Boris Johnson was a massive net popular in the national polls. He was dragging the Conservative vote share up. And I think, so not only did we sort of prove that we were alive and kicking in that by-election, if you look back at national polling across the last Parliament, I think you can trace back the point where the Conservatives started to tick down in national polls to essentially us winning Cheshire and Amersham, because it was the first time that Boris Johnson looked at all vulnerable in that Parliament. If you think just weeks before we won that by-election, the Tories won Hartlepool from Labour in a by-election, stormed the local elections. So actually it was a turning point, not just for us, but for politics. And then we went on to win in North Shropshire, and winning there was really important for us because whilst I think a lot of people had written us off in Cheshire and Amersham, after the event, a lot of people rationalised this as, well, it's sort of Middle England, it voted heavily Remain, it looks a bit like all the places that the Lib Dems won at the last election, so we can probably write it off as that. And then we won in North Shropshire, which was a place that had voted 60% leave in the EU referendum, where the demographics were completely different. But again, we came, and in this one, we didn't start second, we started, I can't actually remember whether we started third or fourth, I think it was third. And came from third to win. And then we also came from third to win in Tiverton. So these were fantastic training opportunities for staff. So we built this new big integrated team of staff across the party. It was a great opportunity to get people kind of really enthused and motivated and trained up on what running a big campaign looks like. And it mobilised a lot of our party donors, couple of whom I can see in the room this evening, and kind of, again, hopefully gave them confidence we knew what we were doing. It also taught us a lot about what was happening to the Conservative vote across the course of the Parliament, and kind of giving away no trade secrets. In these 2 by-elections, we definitely started behind, and the quality of our campaign took us from being behind to being ahead. By the time we got to Somerton and Frome, something fairly fundamental had changed with politics overall, and we could see that we effectively started pretty much on track to winning in that by-election. On the next slide, just a little bit about how we developed some of our messaging. A lot of this started with proper old-fashioned doorstep conversations. I'm a big believer that if you want to understand kind of what people are thinking and what might swing their vote, you have to go and look them in the eye and ask them about what bothers them, what do they care about. At the core of all of our messaging in all of those winning by-elections, it started with door-to-door conversations with our key voters. Then for what we were doing for the national campaign, we honed and prioritised that through additional research. So when we started the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, before the election was called, I went down and spent a day and I just knocked on doors spent all day knocking on doors in every different bit of the constituency, in towns, in villages, in commuter bits, in more established, sort of longer term residential established bits, just trying to understand the issues that were of concern to people and fed those into the campaign, and we reflected them back, and we did the same exercise kind of writ large to hone in on health, on the cost of living and the environment, which were the core themes that we ran the general election on. I'm afraid on the next one, you might have to get, yes, if you go back one for us. Yeah, there we go. Again, at a point where trust in politics was fairly low, we knew that part of the winning mix was that people had to be voting for people they believed in, as well as parties and policies they believed in. So we worked really hard to make sure that our candidates were well known, and whilst they were, overwhelmingly, universally kind of in touch and with the concerns of voters, we wanted to make sure that we were that voters knew that people knew who they were, that they felt that they were approachable, people who understood their daily lives and spoke to their concerns. On the next slide, you're probably going to have to get your trigger finger ready for a lot of that. Having kind of honed our messaging for the election, we then stayed relentlessly on message. So if you just scroll through a load of this stuff. We then repeated these messages quite a lot in a variety of different ways and formats across print and digital media and across doorstep conversations, kind of just repeating our core messages that we'd honed in the way I just described. Oh, there we go. Okay, that wasn't too many. There were a lot more than that. We reviewed progress relentlessly and openly. So we tracked data every month from our key seats and organised seat level interventions to tackle areas where we could see there were issues with performance in certain areas. We did 6 monthly formal reviews, and we shared that data of how people were doing with our candidates and with their key teams. So it wasn't sort of like we were coming and marking their homework. It was a tool we were using to collectively try and improve what we were all doing together. Kind of in this general election, unlike the previous one, I was adamant that we needed to sort of effectively have an all-weather proof plan, which was what happens in a scenario where we get to a general election and the Conservative vote recovers, and what happens in a general election scenario where the Conservative vote doesn't recover. One of the kind of, at any point I get anything wrong, you want to challenge, that's absolutely fine. But one of the things that was most confusing about polling all the way through the last Parliament was the number of people who were just in the undecided column all the time. And they were overwhelmingly people who'd voted Conservative in 2019. And so I think everybody was sort of nervously holding their breath to see what these people would do under the threat, under the actual stress of a general election. And there are two things that, it could be that they were people who'd made a definitive break with the Conservatives and weren't going to go back and were trying to work out what the best next option was. But it's also completely possible that there were people who'd voted Conservative last time, were disillusioned with the government midterm, but in the end might go back when presented with the credible option of not just kicking the current government, but replacing them with someone else. And at different elections over the last 30 years, different groups of undecided voters have done one or the other or combination of both of those things. So we devised a strategy, which was what do we do in the event that those people do go back to the Conservatives, and it's actually a much tighter election overall, or what do we do in the event that they go somewhere else? It was really clear at the start of that Somerton and Frome by-election that the Conservative vote was incredibly weak, and that they had lost a lot of support that wasn't particularly minded to go back. And that was clear from the first 2 or 3 days of just speaking to people on the doorsteps. And I called a meeting of my senior team. There's a photo of this burrito bar, which for anyone who volunteered in the Somerton and Frome by-election was next to the office at Frome Station. They did really good burritos. And we kind of had a team that said, right, like this is going well enough that we need to seriously start investing now in a second wave of target seats that we'd been working in a lower key way with over the previous 2 or 3 years, giving them the tools to develop for themselves, but with support from some key donors and others, we started putting significant resources into those from about a year out, and almost all of them went on to win. But obviously, we kind of had what do we do if we get it to a good general election where voters move away from the Conservatives or move back. I think just organisationally, we were really ready. Some of the nuts and bolts stuff was as good as it's ever been. I insisted that the entire party be ready for a May general election, so that regardless of whether or not one happened, we were putting the organisation through its paces. So simple things like we got all our target seats pretty much. A few refused, and then they were really angry when they realised they'd made a mistake. To print a flying start leaflet in March. March, have it all bundled and ready. So it was ready to go out at the start of the day the general election was called. And the day the general election was called in May, my WhatsApp went mad with people just showing me photographs of bundles of leaflets coming out of car boots because they were already there. Ditto, loads of stake boards going up the day the election was called. As a little aside, ironically, I had my senior team in London the day before and the day the general election was called. The day before, we were actually throwing a goodbye party for someone who was going off to set up his own business, and he ended up staying, of course, for a little bit longer. His farewell gift stayed on the shelf for an extra couple of months. But the day the general election was called, we were actually having a general election planning meeting, and kind of we've been through this sort of cycle a few times of rumours. Is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? You know, lots of speculation. So when the rumours first started coming through, we got the first rumours about 7 o'clock in the morning that the Tories were going to hold some kind of conference at some point in the day about something. It wasn't particularly clear whether it might be a speech about immigration or something else, one of those endless resets they attempted. By about 9 o'clock, the word we were getting was that it was a bit more serious a risk than we'd previously thought. So I threw the agenda for the day out of the window and I said, from now on, we're just going to pretend that the general election is going to get called today. What would we do today if the general election is going to get called this afternoon? So that basically meant that everyone went into overdrive. We had the whole team already on trains on the way down. And by the time they arrived, the general election was just called, and we kind of got people artworking all the first third of the general election campaign. All of our general election templates and artwork and things on our campaign drive were all ready for a May election. So they were literally all there. So we just rolled it out. And I think just in some of that nuts and bolts organizational stuff, we were better prepared than we've ever been. And then we also ran a huge campaign just through our central bulk buy procurement. We printed over 2 million leaflets. I think we did over 55 million digital, I might be wrong, I can't remember if I've made about 55 million digital ad impressions. We had conversations with, we knocked on the doors of 2.7 million voters and spoke to a massive chunk of them. So like we just did a phenomenally large campaign, significantly larger than at the previous general election. So despite the fact that there were fewer members of the Liberal Democrats in 2024 than there were in 2019, we got significantly higher overall levels of activity, despite the fact that there were there were fewer people. And I think that was down to the organisation, the preparation, and that sense of purpose and strategy that and the investment we'd put in developing teams on the ground. And then on the next slide, we knew that kind of how people reacted to Ed personally would be a factor in our success. People don't know who a Lib Dem leader is often until a general election campaign. Journalists tend to write up the Tory and Labour leaders get a lot of coverage and leaders of other parties don't. We knew that it was a critical moment. We put a lot of time and thought into making sure that Ed came across as a friendly, warm, kind human being, which actually for people who know him, he is. And sort of a lot of the conventional thinking in the past might have been about policy announcements or set piece speeches, and actually a lot of it was just about how do we make people like this guy as a relatable, ordinary human being. Because actually for most voters, especially people who weren't committed to one party or another, that was far more important than an understanding of detailed policy positions on anything in particular. And a lot of thought went into how we used visual images to get ourselves into the story in an environment where we could have been written out. And I think it was very clear that Ed just actually had a lot of fun during the general election. And that some of those fun visual images and stunts that we did, all of them came with a serious message about something we wanted to try and do that would change the country for the better, that had it not been attached to a fun, enjoyable, relatable human image, we wouldn't have got the media coverage, and we did because of the way we handled it. And all of that came back, of course, to our core messages, so that if people were having a conversation with a Lib Dem, seeing a digital ad, getting a leaflet through the door, or seeing Ed on the telly, it was absolutely laser focused on those handful of issues that we knew that the swing voters in our target seats were most concerned about. as Lib Dems, we have to fight for every tiny column inch or tiny second clip on the news. So it's super important that when people do hear from us, it's consistent. And I think, again, in this general election, we managed to get the join up of what people were campaigning for on the ground, the campaigns our candidates were running, and what Ed was talking about when he was on the radio or on TV was more joined up and in sync than it's ever been before. We knew how the campaign was going. This is photos of my count night war room. We were tracking over 80 seats throughout the campaign. We cross-referenced both our own internal data and all of the publicly available MRPs. Whilst some of those were a bit rogue, I took the view that one or two, that you can't really trust any one of them completely. But if you looked at the cumulative total of what they were all saying, you'd probably get a fairly decent trend over time of what was happening. And whilst some of them started us on 30 and some of them started us on 50, all of them showed an upward trajectory over the course of the campaign. During the course of the campaign, we progressively moved focus and spending kind of our national spending progressively towards ever more stretching targets. And every seat we won was part of our overnight count operation. There wasn't a single seat that wasn't on my whiteboard. And as a slightly sad thing, that whiteboard is still there. None of us quite dare wipe it off. So we have our main meeting room in our HQ where we can't now use the main whiteboard because no one wants to wipe off the count night memento. And then on the final slide, I think this shows the impact of our campaign. So YouGov, who the YouGov MRPs, I think still stood up as the most authoritative and the ones that best got the seat level nuance of what was going on. And they did one in the couple of weeks after the general election was called, and they did one again that was published eve of poll. And in that period, we put on 24 seats between the same pollster, the same methodology at the start, and the same pollster and the same methodology at the end. And that basically showed the impact that our campaign had compared to all the other parties in terms of seat change over time. And we broke a lot of records. I'm sure there'll be someone in here who can probably think of some more. But we got the most Lib Dem MPs in Parliament ever for the Liberal Democrats, being very clear. The largest ever number of Lib Dem gains. There was not a single seat that we won in a by-election that we lost, which is also a first. And 2 of our 4 by-election wins had twins, which we were very proud of. So 2 of the seats we'd won in by-elections got cut in half. And we didn't just win the seat where the sitting MP defended it, we won the other half as well. So actually our 4 by-election wins turned into 6 seats in the general election, and kind of by every objective measure, we fought the most vote efficient campaign ever in terms of the translation of Lib Dem votes into seats in Parliament. And there we go, there's the result. I think obviously it is fair to say that this was a change election. This was an election where a lot of people wanted to change the government, and we definitely benefited from that. And it's entirely possible that in a different environment, the same campaign might not have got the same result. The way I often describe it is sort of it's maybe a very bad surfing analogy, I don't know, but like we kind of wanted to do a brilliant bit of surfing. We sort of watched the bay, worked out where the place to spot was, did loads of training, got the best surfboard, kind of polished it all up, all the rest of it, and went and put ourselves a place where we thought a good wave would come along, and then a wave came along as well. And so we definitely got part of the result we did because there was kind of an anti-Tory movement in the overall electorate, but we only got the maximum benefit of that because we'd done everything possible to put ourselves in the right position to capitalize on it. And so the benefit of those 2 things happening definitely helped us in this election. And then I think there's one more slide potentially. Yes, which is finally just we have a really clear mandate from our campaign. I felt I ought to just follow a few bits of data. So we definitely went out there and fought probably one of the most consistent campaigns the party has ever fought, where what we were saying, what Ed was saying on the TV and radio matched the closest to, you know, to what people were saying on the doorstep and in leaflets. And when you went back afterwards and asked people why did they vote Lib Dem, they said they liked what we were saying on healthcare, they liked our local candidate, they liked our policies on the environment, and they knew that we were the best bet to, in most cases, beat the Conservatives, although we also did go from 4 to 6 seats in Scotland against the SNP as well. And so if you look at the things we set out to achieve with our campaign, we delivered them in the election, and they are the reasons that people went out and voted for us. And kind of, I just think, you know, the thing I always say to our MPs now, who are sort of very enthusiastic on board with this, is we just have a really clear mandate. We set out a really clear platform around healthcare, around tackling the cost of living, and around the environment. And that's what we're going to carry on campaigning on in this Parliament. So I'll leave it there and happy to take questions later.
You won, but you didn't expect to win, and really thought it was, you know, really difficult.
I think we now have plenty of time for discussion questions, and what I'd like to do is to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then allow the others to come back. And perhaps, where's the mic? Paul, you've got it. Just while you're thinking of your questions, my favourite anecdote of the campaign, which some of you may have heard, is the one about wondering whether or not we would hold the Shropshire by-election. And early in the campaign, Helen Morgan was in a village and a bus passed by and the bus driver stopped and got out because he wanted to shake the candidate's hand. And everyone in the bus waved at her and thought, well, she's going to win. And when Helen was asked whether the story is true, she said in her best modest style, well, it was only a small bus. Who would like to? Let's take you, and then one.
My question was simply, what seat did you win that you really didn't expect to win?
Okay. Oh. One on the back there.
Thank you. It's obviously fantastic we've got 72 MPs, but where next? Not in like a cocky way that we're gonna like excel further, but more in a way that goes, actually we should be more ambitious for where we go after this, particularly with reference to Labour facing seats.
Michael.
Thank you. I hope I've been around long enough and won seats from Labour in difficult circumstances to be able to make 1 or 2 slightly discordant points. Firstly, although the brilliant work of Dave McCobb and others obviously maximised the whole thing and did well, but the basic fact is that had the Tory vote not collapsed and had not Reform polled sufficiently well, we would have won nothing like 72 seats. For the likes of us who've soldiered on through the wilderness, winning the odd seat here and there, to have 72 MPs is miraculous, and I really salute that. But I don't believe there's a dichotomy between winning seats and winning votes. And an example where that is obviously untrue is the whole swathe of seats in southwest London, where the fact that there's a Liberal presence of voting all over the area means that you win seats better than you would otherwise do. If you don't go and have votes and have a core vote, then when you want to win 1 seat out of a group, then it's much more difficult if you haven't got a presence elsewhere. So that's important. But in the course of that, I also think that we ought not to deceive ourselves. I'm all in favour of deceiving the other parties and bamboozling the media. But in fact, to win 72 seats, it was on a lower vote than 2019. And we lost 231 deposits. That means probably 1/3 of the country lacks a self-starting Liberal Democrat presence. And I think we have to build a core vote. I mean, Dave talked, for instance, about by-elections, but the one by-election which was significant was one with an appalling result. That was Tamworth. We polled 1.6%. And that's the lowest Liberal Democrat vote since the war. And we have to look carefully as to why that is. And the fact that there's no class vote for Liberal Democrats and so on is both a benefit and also a problem. We must look carefully at the need to build a core vote. Otherwise, once the Tories do come back, if they do, where the reform allows it, if you like, the 72 seats, many of them will be just washed away with the wind, if you mix metaphor. And I think, therefore, it's important that we do build a party. It's certainly in the big cities where the vote was appalling. Outside London, not one seat was won in any of the big cities in England. And we have to look carefully at the derisory votes of some of the Liberal Democrat candidates in the big cities. So the two things go together, to win seats and to win votes. And we really have to grapple with the need to build a core vote to go on to the next stage. I don't believe that Labour is going to be anything like as popular as they might once thought. I think that the way that they've performed in this short time since they won has been absolutely appalling. And I think the disillusion with them is already apparent. And we need to take that account when we're looking towards a strategy of winning votes and winning seats. Thank you.
Can I just add into the pitch? Paula, absolutely rightly, in my opinion, posed the biggest question which we all have to face. Are we actually at the end of the two-party system? A number of seats were won on 30% or less of the vote. And at that point, you know, almost anything could happen in a very large number of seats next time. And if party loyalty and affiliation has shrunk to the point where a very large number of voters could float in several different directions, then how on earth one responds to that sort of disillusioned and disengaged electorate is really difficult. And you said, Dave, we need to get to the 45% needed to win a seat. We won several seats on less than a third of the vote, didn't we? Okay, comment. Oh, that's...
I think most of the questions are really Dave's wheelhouse rather than mine. If I could just make a comment on the kind of the two-party system, the vulnerability, what might happen next. I mean, Rob and I did a number of podcasts and things together during the campaign where we're just sitting there going, there's no such thing as a safe seat. And I think that's where we're at. And it's probably where we're going to stay. And we're in a situation where, you know, you're talking about Labour might not be very popular, the Conservatives might recover a bit, Reform might do this, Greens might do that. Some side sweep issue might come along with a whole new raft of independents for everybody to compete against. And I think that's the new reality. And that is where you do have to have the concentration in certain places in order to be able to get over that, what might turn out to be a 35% threshold in an awful lot of places. I think I'd also just, there was a question about Labour facing seats. And I think this is an issue for the party to wrestle with. It's not an issue for me to tell you the answer. It's an issue for the party to wrestle with. If you try to win lots of Labour facing seats, what is going to happen to all those liberal left voters that voted for you in the 72 seats you win? And if they go, those seats go, no question, no matter what any of the other parties do, those seats go. So tackling Labour head on might be your instincts and might be the right strategy, but it has got dangers inherent to it as well.
Dave.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me all right? So in response to the first, probably the most straightforward question, which is where did we win that we weren't expecting? We won a number of seats that probably 6 weeks out from polling day, I suspect most people weren't expecting us to. By the end, there wasn't a single seat we won that wasn't part of our overnight count operation. We didn't win a single seat that wasn't on my whiteboard. I think it is fair to say that whilst no individual seat that we won took us by surprise, the fact that we won as many as we did on the whiteboard probably was at the upper end of expectations. In terms of the other two questions, I think actually my answer would be fairly similar to Paula's comment, really, which is there was a poll out last week that had, I think it was the first one ever that had Reform ahead. I think they were on 26% or something, and we were on 12 or 13. And kind of you know, lots of chat about what do we do about all of this. I guess the sort of the thing I took from that is 4 years ago, had we been on 12%, which we weren't, had we been on 12%, we would have been 32% behind the party that was in the lead. We're now 14% behind the party that's in the lead. And I think if we are in an environment where we get up to 5 parties polling within 10 or 15% of each other, what a first past the post electoral system throws out of the other end could be really, really unpredictable. And for me, this comes back to what I want to develop are strong Lib Dem teams in local parties who'll go out and run a really, really, really big campaign. Because on William's point about the 45% to win a seat, you know, a lot of the conventional thinking would have been that you needed, that the parties in general needed to get to 45% of the vote to win a seat in this country. It might well be that at the general election, there are very, very few seats where you need more than 35 to win, particularly, you know, and not, you know, there aren't going to be that many seats where 5 parties are all necessarily competitive, but there could easily be quite a lot of seats where 3 of the 5 parties are relatively competitive. So that, for me, brings it back to, we need to grow our grassroots organisation. We need to use, in this parliament, build up a base in local government across as broad a footprint as possible. And we need to have people who are ambitious to win everywhere, and we need to create the mechanisms to support them in doing it.
Can I add a comment to that, actually? That just made me think of something. So at the start of my talk, I said that, you know, you started off in a lucky position because you were facing the Conservatives in most of the seats that you were most likely to win. I mean, in some senses, right now, you're also in quite a lucky position because the Conservatives are the main opposition in the seats you need to hold on to, and they're not interested in fighting with you. So, so actually, you're in quite a lucky position compared to some of the other parties who have got multiple kind of dimensions to the parties that they're facing. Labour facing Greens in some places, Reform in some places, Conservative in some places. If the target next time is to hold on to the strength of this time, which in a parliament that could be even more fragmented might be an even stronger hand in some ways, the same number of MPs could be a stronger hand. The fact that the main opposition to you are not interested in talking about you or against you in any way, shape or form might be quite a nice place to be.
Sorry, no, but just on this point, because I think it probably goes to the nub of quite a few of the questions. Of the 72 seats that we currently hold, we won 6 facing the SNP, and we won the other 66 against the Conservatives. And if you look at the seats where we're second or a strong third, they're overwhelmingly also against the Conservatives in terms of places where we're closest mathematically to winning at the next general election. And as Paul said, the Conservatives do not know what to do with themselves because they're obsessed with seeing off reform. Labour have tactically a really, really difficult problem because they're facing the Greens in some sort of city centre metropolitan areas. They've got a whole swathe of seats that they won back from the Tories, where Reform have now leapfrogged the Tories into in some places quite decent second places, and they've got their traditional battleground against the Conservatives. So actually, in some ways, for some of the other parties, it's a bigger challenge than it is for us, just looking at the landscape.
Where did you point to, William? Just behind you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Dave, thank you very much for what you've done. If you can move that to other constituencies, as Michael was suggesting, that there are in Cornwall 4 Labour seats stuck between 2 Lib Dem ones, and we used to have all 6 seats in Cornwall. There are 2 Labour seats left in Oxfordshire. I think they should be attacked. Similarly in Cambridgeshire, because at this election, people were just getting the Tories out and the Nationalists out. It was a very negative thing. Whereas I think we've got an opportunity here to really grow, but we need money and we need your organisation.
Thank you. The third row just here in the light jacket.
Thank you very much. I must admit the speakers that we've had have done a lot to enthuse me today. The thing that I'm struggling with is the contrast between what they're saying and what it says in the actual report. For example, we say things about, you know, we did all these great things and we've got well organized, we do this sort of thing. But the key threats that we've got are sort of not being addressed. It's very much a procedural looking document as this. There's lots about how we improve our internal procedures a bit. Whereas the big threats to us are the big strategic things, as was raised by, sorry, I can't remember your name, but I was very impressed with what you said, Paul, which is, you know, what happens with reform? And one of the things that I'm fundamentally believe is that people actually are stopping voting for party political things. They're voting on the basis of competence. The Conservatives proved they were totally incompetent. And that's where they collapsed. Untrustworthy also came into it, but those two factors were major things. Labour have made such an appalling mess of their first few months. Those two things, if Labour make a total mess of it, the ones who are seriously pigged off could pile in behind reform. I think we've got to make sure that we are demonstrating and stating and saying the arguments, we are the competent ones. And if we can do that in local government, and if we can do that in local government where the funding is right up the spout, we'll deserve it. The other thing I'll say is there's one or two things. I mean, I used to work in internal audit. I did loads of reviews of stuff. And when you get a thing that sort of says, we need to get more members, but it isn't a conclusion there. The only thing it says about members is we need lots more ethnically diverse people. But actually, I don't agree with that. We need more Liberal Democrat members, period. And more will come. If we're going to target properly, the target seats aren't going to be very many of them in those areas that are ethnically diverse, I'm afraid. We might have to accept that. But if we're competent, we will eventually win enough people over to make that thing, make the progress we need.
Take the hand furthest to the back, as you can see.
Thanks. A quick question for each of our panelists, and thanks to Dave for a great presentation. I didn't quite see the words Hunger Games in there when you saw the KPIs, but I can think of one of our 72 colleagues who has been known to use the terms, but my goodness, did they work. For Paula, I got a sense during the election of going around a housing estate in Bicester where it became clear that it was on. And that was when I went round and door after door after door of people said, I've always voted Conservative. Perhaps they had, and perhaps they hadn't. But I've just had enough with this lot. I want them out, and I voted Liberal Democrat. I think my question is there a demographic in any of the data that brings that out and bears that in mind? And to Dave, in terms of our ambition, which I think should be limitless, but it has to be borne in mind against the amount of resources that we've got. To what extent do our 72 colleagues understand how important their role is in making all of those seats fortresses so that you and your team can get on and then win the next 72 and more beyond?
Dave, you first.
Thanks very much. Some really interesting questions. It's kind of overlapping in many ways. So the question about where we target next time, I do think that actually there is a critical mass that's developed in some places now. Like during the general election, if you drove through Surrey, if you drove through southwest London and Surrey, you would probably go from one Lib Dem held constituency to another. You'd see Lib Dem state boards everywhere. You'd probably see Lib Dems out canvassing in most places. And actually just and the same is happening in parts of the West Country, in Somerset. And actually, if there are seats near places where we already have an existing base of support, being able to have that ripple effect that we definitely did in some places, the general election, if we can build the organisation and capitalise on it right, is definitely one of the ways we could look to go. In terms of Gareth's question about retaining sitting MPs, so I think one of the things that often happens, and I was looking back at, in preparation for this year, actually, I was looking back at some of the stats of vote share changes between 1997 and 2001, which was the last time there was a big, significant leap forward in number of Lib Dem MPs. And with one or two exceptions, you saw this pattern of, we won in 97 by uniting but more or less by uniting all the people who didn't want the Conservatives to win. And then in 2001 took another massive chunk out of the Conservative vote as people decided they liked the sort of the experience of having a Lib Dem MP who did things really, really differently. I am sure for a lot of our MPs, the last 6 months have been a bit of a learning curve. And, you know, it is becoming an MP is actually pretty mad. I'd never quite been close enough to this in volume myself before to see it, but it's things like they went on the stage at some ungodly hour on the Friday morning, they got declared the MP, within hours the House of Commons turns on an email address, and by Sunday they had 10,000 emails from people saying, well, you're now my MP, what are you going to do? And at the same time they were trying to hire staff, set up an office, get themselves to London, find somewhere to live. That is an insane experience for any human being to have to live through, I think. We have to cut everybody a bit of slack for the first 6 months while people get themselves up and running, but now it's absolutely full on. But I absolutely do think that if we kind of get it right in the seats we won this time, the opportunity to grow out from those seats next time is huge, because the experience from 1997 to 2001 was when people got a Lib Dem MP, they liked it.
Thank you. So taking the first comments about competence, I mean, lots of people have written the story of the 2024 election and called it, you know, an election about competence. Nobody thought the Conservatives were. That's a good story about why the Conservatives lost, but it really doesn't help explain where votes went to. And I think that's the problem with it. And it's very, very difficult for opposition parties to improve their standing on competence, because there's so little that you can really demonstrate. But to understand, you know, Labour didn't lose votes to the Greens because of competence. People weren't voting for reform because they thought they were competent, particularly. So it takes you so far, but it's not the whole story. And I think it's too easy an explanation for 2024 that then glosses over all that churn and fragmentation that's still there as we come out of the election. The question about the Conservatives and demographics. So because it was a summer election, I spent a lot of the campaign driving around the Cotswolds to various village cricket grounds because my kids were playing cricket in the evenings. And the one thing I noticed driving around some very well-to-do, very, very pretty villages in the Cotswolds was that I did not see a single Conservative poster or board in any of them. And that's when I knew what was going to happen. And I was already telling people quite early on that to ignore the 12% the Lib Dems were getting, they were going to get a lot more seats than that. I said that's like taking the SNP share of the vote and spreading it across 650 constituencies. In terms of that demographic, though, that have turned away from the Conservatives, I think you find lots of them in those Cotswold villages, actually. So they're people who are relatively financially secure, likely to own their own home, a little bit older, had probably voted Conservative for quite a long time, and they probably still said they were going to vote Conservative even after Partygate, because as long as the Conservatives were perceived to be managing the economy okay, they would probably just about stick with them. But the Truss interlude completely destroyed their faith in the Conservatives. So that's the group that I would say fit into that demographic. And they're not just in the Cotswolds, obviously, they're in all sorts of other places, and they are in some of the cities as well. But that was kind of symbolic of it for me, that I would drive around these villages and you would see Lib Dem posters. In some of them around the Stroud area, you'd see Green posters, maybe Labour posters. You didn't see a single Conservative one in that whole period.
Two questions on that.
Shall we
I'll
take?
read them.
Please do.
So two online questions. One, I think they're both for Dave. One from Peter Wrigley. I live in Kirklees, where we lost our deposits in all 4 of our constituencies, including Colne Valley and Huddersfield, where we've had Liberal or Lib Dem MPs in my lifetime. Why was there no standard literature designed to attract activists to keep the party alive in currently non-target seats? And the other one from Andy Ellis. Looking back at the by-election record, the Mid-Bedfordshire by-election was presumably a more difficult episode of the by-election story. If it was, as it appeared, a battle to be the progressive alternative against the collapsing Tories, why was that in the end lost, and what were the lessons taken forward?
Thanks very much. So in response to the first question, there was. It's on the party's campaign hub. If you're a party member, all the resources are free. www.libdems.org.uk/access. For non-target seats, there was a complete suite of election address literature. You could download entirely 100% national stuff that people could just pick up and buy. In addition to all the stuff that was available for our target seats. So in answer to that question, I'm sorry if you missed it, but fundamentally it was there. And actually one of the things that I feel most proud of is, as well as obviously the result we got in the general election, was some of the feedback we got from local parties that were at the kind of development and startup end of their journey, was that it felt for a lot of them like it was the first time there was actually materials available designed with them in mind. So I'm sorry if people missed it. We know that kind of sometimes these things don't get through, but fundamentally it was there. In terms of Mid Bedfordshire, I think Andy's completely right. Obviously, it was in most of the other by-elections, it was pretty clear who the challenge to the Conservatives was in that election, and in Mid Bedfordshire, it wasn't. I actually think, whilst obviously I talked about the 4 by-elections that we won, I also think we got a pretty impressive result in Mid Bedfordshire in an environment where actually all 3 parties, and Reform as well at times, there were 4 parties mounting a serious contest to try and win that seat. And we still managed to be the party that put our vote up most. And we were the only party that got more votes than they got at the previous election. So we put, Labour won, but they got fewer votes than they got in 2019. The Conservatives lost with obviously far, far fewer votes. We actually put on real votes in that election. And to do the thing that several people have asked about, which is build for the long term, we have to be prepared to fight and win sometimes in places where we might not win this time, but we might win the time after, and we've just got to carry on building our vote share. And so I think actually we did in the circumstances of all the parties piling in, do quite well in that by-election to get as high a vote share and as many votes as we did.
Let's take further 2 questions. I'll take one from the front. Yeah.
I just wondered how what influence Trump, his method of winning, firstly, and how he's sort of dynamically governed in the first few months, but how that has influenced or will influence politics here. And I'm just wondering slightly whether Rachel Reeves suddenly saying that Heathrow Airport, et cetera, are going to be built is almost in a way being Trumpian, isn't it? Sort of.
Let's take the one absolutely at the back. Yeah.
The man in red.
Thank you very much, the man in red. Great presentations, both of you, and look forward to really digesting the slides. And Dave, again, many, many thanks. Phenomenal campaign from where we were to where we ended up. Questions really for both of you. How much do you assess the community champion characteristic adds votes, percentage votes is important? I mean, obviously we played on it hugely, but in the statistics, has that been picked out? Secondly, just by way of introduction, the turnout, of course, in this summer election, bizarrely, was far lower than the turnout in the December election, where we all thought it would be really low before, and we have to factor that in. But is it likely, would it be your assessment, and I accept the proposition that Reform and Greens are going to be much bigger players at the next election, and in Scotland and Wales, the Nationalists too, possibly, that the seats we're likely to find easiest to hold or win are where it's a clear 1-2 battle, where we're either defending, and we know who the principal opponent is, or we are second, and therefore we can make the case, if you're going to change the party, then come to us. My old seat is exactly one of those. We are clearly second to Labour. And thirdly, what about the tactics of trying to separate the country in campaigning terms in the future between those places which will be straight 1-2 battles and the other places, the old Inverness seats where Russell used to get elected on 25.5% of the vote 4 times in a row, from what I recollect, where actually it's going to be a really difficult 3- or 4-way battle. and where we should assume the Greens and Reform, at least in England, may be big players.
Can I abuse the chair and ask a couple of historical questions? I've just been looking again at the first really in-depth electoral survey of Whitton, the Butler-Stokes data, and what it said about the Liberal vote then. And it goes into the issue of the potential Liberals, the ones who were sympathetic to the Liberals, but who may or may not end up voting Liberal depending on what they thought about the constituency, which other party they feared most if it became a government, etc. I think Paula was suggesting that category is still there somewhere, and it probably is about a quarter of the electorate. And the question is, how does one mobilize it? But related to that, I've read quite a lot about party de-alignment, and also quite a lot in opinion surveys recently about disillusionment with politics as such. Whereas in the 1960s, partisan loyalty was still very strong. So to Paula, are we now in a really facing a very different electorate in terms of how it approaches politics and parties as such? And that makes it much more difficult for all of us. And finally, Michael Meadowcroft raised the question about Labour-held seats. After 1997, we found it much easier to gain local seats and occasionally parliamentary seats in Labour-held areas because Labour was in government and people who had voted Labour were disillusioned with government. Is that a historical development which we are likely to see repeated again? Whichever party is in power, it's easier for the Liberals to distinguish themselves from it when it comes to it. Which you would like to take these various questions first?
Have a go at some of those. That's quite a set of questions. Let's have a go at them roughly in order. So I don't really want to speculate too much on the Trump influence on politics here. I'll focus entirely on voters because that's what I know about. And I think the most likely influence is that it could motivate further tactical voting. If you look at some of the chart I put up towards the end, there are several groups of voters who would have very strong opposition to any chance of a Reform MP, and that will motivate more tactical voting. I think we've seen immediately post the Brexit referendum, immediately after the first Trump presidency, a kind of what I call activated Liberals. So people who, once they feel that something they really care about is under threat, they become more activated, they become more active in terms of campaigning, and they're much more likely to turn out to vote. So it kind of brings both of those things together in terms of voting against something. So that's how I think Trump might influence the politics. The macroeconomic politics, the foreign policy, I'll leave to other experts in the room. But in terms of voters, I think that might be the case. Sorry, so the turnout, there was a question about turnout. Of all the things I thought about the summer election, I didn't expect turnout to crash like it did. I was surprised by that. I thought the mood was so much, we want to get rid of the Conservatives, that would motivate people to turn out. I think we don't know. This is pure speculation because we haven't got good turnout data for a few more months. But I think people thought that kicking out the Conservatives was actually just going to happen anyway, and so that stopped that playing out. So I think that's the main reason there. Sorry, I'll go through all the questions while I've got the mic. I think this speaks also to this idea of potential Liberals, party de-alignment. I do think the electorate now is different in all sorts of areas of life. There is not that same sense of anchoring to institutions that there used to be. And parties are part of that, churches are part of that, unions are part of that, a whole raft of institutions that people are no longer connected to. and no longer take their political cues from. So I think we're in a world where it's much harder for a party to lead on an issue in the way they might have done in the past and take their voters with them. And so what we see are parties being much more reactive to voters, but voters themselves are quite volatile. So we end up with both parties and voters being quite volatile. I think I showed in the thing, nobody, very few people say they would actively vote against the Liberal Democrats. So there's actually lots of potential Liberals out there, but it's finding the critical mass of them, because just finding another 10% of them everywhere across the country isn't going to help. It's got to be that critical mass. And I can't actually read what I've written there. Oh, that was the final point was, in that 1997 period that you were talking about, and I don't mean this to sound rude at all, but the Liberal Democrats benefited from being the choice for the none of the above people. So the people who just didn't want to tick any of the other boxes. And the problem now, in terms of trying to do that again, is there are now a lot of options for the none of the above people, and it's much, much harder to mobilize that anti-government support, whichever party it is, because there are so many other choices for those people who just want to, I don't like any of this kind of option.
Dave, last word.
I guess just following up on the last point, the thing that gives me optimism in that area is if you look at who Labour 2024 voters choose as their second preference in most polls, they do choose us much more strongly than any of the other parties. So I think there is an opportunity there. And the question about kind of prospects against Labour, I mean, if I were Labour, I'd be really quite worried. Council by-election results are not the be-all and end-all of where things ultimately end up, but they're usually a good sort of signpost of the overall trajectory. And we went through a period in the autumn where there were several weeks where Labour lost every single seat they were defending to whoever else showed up. They literally, there's one week where they lost 4, and they lost 4 to 4 different parties. It was whoever turned up and tried to beat them. And in a string of by-elections, they were losing sort of a third of their vote from the previous election every time. So I think there is Labour do have reason to be worried. And I think just going back to the turnout question from the general election again, I'd probably say this is personal speculation and not necessarily borne out by any data. I'd love to see some data if anyone ever, if anyone kind of has some to point at me. But I think that turnout thing was probably made up of 2 things. One of them was, my instinct is that there was a block of voters who voted Leave in 2016, Conservative in 2019, who just sat out the 2024 general election. They kind of didn't think reform was credible enough to go and vote for. They couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Conservatives, and so they sat it out. And I think if you look at some turnout stats, I think there's probably some signs of that. And the other thing is an underpin, which links back to the problem Labour have got now, is that there was actually no real enthusiasm for Labour. There was a huge amount of enthusiasm to go and kick the Tories out. There was no actual enthusiasm for Labour. So in all those seats where a Labour win was a foregone conclusion, some people felt able to not vote at all, vote for other parties, and compounded by the probability of the overall outcome. So I suspect the turnout issue is probably a combination of both of those 2 things. And kind of the reason I sort of think that Leave 2019 Conservative voter thing is real is kind of looking through, there's a poll out this week which traced back so Reform are obviously doing a bit better recently. Where is that coming from? And there is a decent sized block of people who are saying to pollsters now they're going to vote Reform who didn't vote in 2024. And so I wonder if there is this sort of link of people back to Leave plus Con 19, didn't really want to vote for anyone this time. And now, because Reform looks like they've got a bit more momentum than they did pre-general election, and now feeling they can come back out of the woodwork and kind of vote for them. If that is the case, actually, it compounds the likelihood of lots of seats being won on relatively low vote shares at the next general election. In terms of Trump's influence, kind of, I think I just generally agree with kind of what Paula said. I think it probably does motivate the Reform UK base to feel sort of emboldened and empowered that there's people who say things they like on an international stage. In terms of Simon's point, but in terms of tactical voting, it's really clear that whilst Reform are currently polling, mid-20s, there's a whole load of people who would definitely vote for anyone but them as well. And if I kind of think a little bit like happened in Scotland with the SNP, kind of the one thing that has managed to get Labour voters to vote Conservative and vice versa has been that they hate the SNP more than they hate either of those two. And there might be that happens in some places at the next general election, where people kind of vote very much against their traditional lines because they dislike Reform UK more than they kind of like anybody or dislike anybody else. In terms of Simon's point about where we go next, does second place matter? Clearly it does help. If one of the things we have to do is persuade people we're competitive to get a critical mass of votes, starting in second place is massively helpful. But we have also historically won seats from third place by getting up but basically by building momentum through consecutive local government elections. And yes, we did, most of the seats we won this time were seats we started in second place, but we did also gain momentum through winning successive rounds of local elections at the same time. And in terms of that sort of, can we get votes? I'm really heartened by the fact that there isn't a block of people who actively dislike the Lib Dems and will go out and vote against us. Because in a first past the post system, potentially where you need to get 30% of the vote, and you need to build a coalition of people coming from different perspectives to get there. If we're the people that, where we don't have if we're the party that has the least drag on the ticket, our ability to do that at speed is much better. So there we go.
Well, we have reached 8 o'clock, I'm afraid, and I know there are several other people who wanted to ask questions. I'm very sorry that we can't take them. I'd like to thank you all for the questions, and in particular to thank our two speakers and those who've looked in online. I found this fascinating. I look forward to the next election campaign and the rationalizations that people will make afterwards as to why it could have been foreseen, even though it's probably absolutely not foreseeable at all at the present time. Paula, thank you very much indeed. Dave, thanks, as always.